I did worse singers or harder songs. So have you ever been singing along to the radio in the car or anywhere really and felt completely incapable of like hitting some of the notes? Either it doesn't sound good or it's uncomfortable, perhaps even painful, and you just sit there wondering how these pop stars do it day in and day out, um, at concerts and in the studio. Okay, maybe you don't sing as much and you haven't really thought about it. But how about those of us who do sing a bit? Why can't we sound even a little bit like the recording? Well, my first thought was autotune. Most people have heard of it. Not many know exactly what it does. Essentially, it's pitch correction software. You sing the wrong note in, do some beep boop on a computer, and bam, you're singing the right note. Incredible, right? So my first hypothesis was that songs are harder to sing now because because artists are using autotune to sing things that may not be physically feasible. The only issue I had with this was that I had no way of proving pitch correction was used on any of the songs I might analyze. So I had to scratch that whole idea. But then I was left with the simple question, are songs getting harder to sing? To answer this question, I first had to define what makes a song hard to sing. I determined through my research 3 criteria which affect a melody's difficulty: the passaggio, the range, and the tempo. Passaggio is a musical term which describes the pitch or pitches at which the voice changes registers. This means the vocal folds change how they produce notes around this range, the passaggio. Classical singers are taught how to navigate the passaggios to seamlessly switch between these registers, whereas pop singers and the general public are generally less trained in this respect, therefore rendering the passaggio harder to sing around. I considered songs centered around either of the 2 passaggios. There's a lower and an upper. So any song centered around either one of these 2 points, meaning having 51% or more of the notes in those ranges, I considered those to be more difficult than songs that do not. So the second criterion I looked at was the range. In my research, I read that classical singers only need a little under an octave and a half, or a range of a tenth about. So they only need that much to have a performing range that is suitable for classical singing. If you don't know what an octave is, so a tenth is a little bit more than an octave, and an octave is the low do to the high do in the song My Favorite Things. So, do, a deer, a female deer, and that brings us back to do, 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 do. That's an octave. So a tenth is just a little wider than what I just sang. So considering that classical singers generally don't need a performing range of more than that, I considered pop songs that exceeded this to be more difficult than those that don't. The third and final criterion I created looked at the tempo. So essentially, how fast is the song? I could, look at maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So you see how those are different. So a study I read found that participants sang more accurately when they sang more slowly. So I hypothesized that a faster tempo would make a song harder to sing. So once I figured out my criteria for analyzing the songs, I had to figure out which songs to analyze, how many I would analyze, and how I would go about analyzing them. I ended up choosing the top 10 songs from each decade from the 1970s to the 2010s, according to the Billboard charts. Billboard analyzes not only radio play, but streaming and music sales to create their list of the most popular music. So I felt it would be the perfect resource to use for this project. This ended up giving me a large range of music, 50 songs in total, from Let's Get It On by Marvin Gaye to Old Town Road by Lil Nas X and Billy Ray Cyrus. To analyze these songs, first I transcribed them. I didn't, however, make it into sheet music, as you might expect. I wanted to use a computer to help my analysis, so I had to create a transcription that a computer could understand. This led me to make Midi files. A Midi file is simply a file that stores musical information as numbers. For example, middle C, or the centermost key named C on the piano keyboard, you can see it in this picture here, is the number 60. To create these Midi files, I listened to the song and then played the melody I heard on the keyboard, which when connected to my computer, recorded the information as a Midi file. So with these files, I then used a program created by one of my peers, Oscar Ibanez, which simply listed how many times a note appeared in each of the song's files. For example, I would load the song file into the program and it would tell me A sharp was played, 5 times, F was played 10 times, G was played 3 times, and so on and so forth. This allowed me to determine the range and most common notes within the song. So once I had the range of each song, I was then able to determine the range score, which is an indicator that I developed for this research. Essentially, it tells me how many half steps over an octave the melody is. So a half step is the smallest difference in pitch that exists in most Western music. So if you know the Jaws theme, da-na-na-na-na-na-na, that's a half step. For example, the melody's range extended, if the melody's range extended from C, the key in the first, or the first key in the light purple range in the picture, and then if it extended to the C above that, the first key in the dark purple range, would have a range score of 0, because that's exactly an octave. Each key higher than that would increase the range score by 1. In terms of my research, a range score over 6 indicated a hard melody because the range of the song exceeded an octave and a half. So in the next sections, I'm going to break down my data for each criterion and then discuss my conclusion. First off, the Passaggio. Because there were so few notes across all of the songs that were in the upper Passaggio, it ended up not yielding any information. The lower Passaggio, however, was revealed to be a kind of upper boundary for melodies. What I mean by this is few melodies went above the lower Passaggio. In fact, most of the notes in like 76% of the songs were below the range of the Passaggio, excuse me. But I didn't see any kind of pattern or trend when analyzing the songs chronologically. There was no meaningful difference in change between the 1970s and the 2010s in terms of Passaggio and where the notes were placed in those ranges. So when looking at the tempo, the data shows just a fairly consistent average tempo across all the decades. Even the fastest and slowest songs of each decade are generally at similar tempos. The only interesting thing, which I am still investigating, is the 90s slowdown. My data showed that the top 10 most popular songs in the 90s were noticeably slower than all the other decades. When I looked at the range score according to decade, a similar pattern emerged. The average range score across all the decades was centered around 5, and the highest and lowest range scores were also almost the same values in each decade, especially the 2000s and the 2010s, which are almost identical. When taking my 3 criteria, the Passaggio, the tempo, and the range score in isolation, all 3 indicate there being no trend over time. Essentially, songs have not been getting harder to sing. I do have a little bit more data I'd like to present, mostly because it helps explain my earlier findings. When I analyzed the top 10 slowest and fastest songs by their range score, I found that faster songs tended to have a lower average range score, and slower songs tended to have a higher range score. What this means is that slower songs tend to require someone to sing higher and lower compared to a faster song. As you can hopefully see on my charts, I know they're kind of small. The top 10 slowest songs had an average range score of 7.6 and almost 2 half steps over an octave and a half, whereas slower songs had an average range score of 2.3, or almost 4 half steps lower than an octave and a half. What this data indicates to me is that while individual songs may be more difficult in respect to one another, with a lot of notes in the Passaggio or a large range, for example, when they are taken collectively as a decade, they even each other out. Where one song has a very large range, there are 2 or 3 others with very small ranges. Also, when one song is difficult in one respect, say it has a range score of 10, like One Sweet Day, it has a slower tempo, making it easier in that regard. It's like each aspect balances out the others, where one could be considered difficult, another will compensate by being easier. So why does it matter? The big question. Well, my research can help music educators, first of all, to understand how they might aid their students in learning music. My criteria for difficulty can be applied to most vocal music. So if a director notices their students having trouble with a song or choral piece, it can provide a framework for analyzing the piece to determine exactly what these students need the most help with, allowing the educator to adjust their teaching to accommodate these difficulties. It can also help composers determine what difficulty level their piece might be, as well as how to adapt it for different skill levels. For example, if the range of the soprano line, generally the highest voices in a choir, exceeds an octave and a half, could be changed slightly to accommodate a lower skilled choir or a choir with limited ranges to make it easier to perform. My research also furthers our understanding of songwriting, points to a tendency to adjust one aspect, such as the tempo, to accommodate another, like the range. Whether or not this is intentional is yet to be investigated. It also suggests that these kinds of criteria could be created for all kinds of music, instrumental or vocal. There's so much yet to discover in the realm of determining musical difficulty, and my research has barely scratched the surface. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.